I should point something out that I sort of alluded to before, and that is the role of class. There certainly is class before the rise of industrialism in the West. You had your nobility, your landed elites, and of course your peasants, and anybody else that was below that would certainly be even worse off than the peasant. But it's during industrialism that you had the creation of multi class societies that were far more dynamic than we really saw beforehand. You still had your nobility and you still had landed elites, but you also had small hold farmers. You had plantation masters and plantation planters. I guess I should say planters, a planting class. They of course existed before, but you have more of them, and you also have an industrial working class, a true middle class, an upper middle class, or maybe a bourgeois class, and a professional class. And they all experienced the Industrial Revolution very differently from each other. For example, if you worked as an ad man on Fifth Avenue, and you were all you did was simply market things to people who were shopping at department stores or dry goods stores, or buying things through catalogs, which also became very popular at the time as well. You experienced the Industrial Revolution and the rise of this market-oriented capitalism very different from, say, the people that you see here who worked in the factories and labored to build most of the things that you were selling. It was a very different type of society and a very different type of world. People who worked in factories were typically subjected to very predatory practices. For example, the people here, I don't really know who they were, but they could easily be living in what was called a company town. A company town was a city or a neighborhood in which the housing was entirely owned by the company that they worked for. Usually this was in coal mines, but it was with other companies as well. And the people who worked there had to pay rent out of their wages to the company to live in that housing. Bear in mind that they really had no choice. They were paid often in company script, which is unofficial currency that could be used at the company store to buy goods that they needed, typically at a very high price. And company script could not be used at other stores that weren't part of the company because it really wasn't money. It wasn't actual money. And so you really had a lot of predatory practices at this time. So for all the benefits that you have with these department stores, and you had these dry goods stores, and you had all of these auxiliary jobs and markets and genres of work that came out of this, like telephone operators and department store workers and clothiers and merchants and things like that, to the degree that you never had before, you also had people that were experiencing this differently in a much more negative light. Although one could argue that perhaps working in a factory was better than starving in the fields, but still, it's debatable because people who did work in the fields did keep a lot of the things that they grew for themselves and only had to sell a little bit to either survive or sell it to pay their rent. In this case, the case of the factory worker, they did not own the things that they were making, and they did not own the place where they worked. They were simply replaceable tools at the hands of the factory operator. And you can sense where we're going with this. We're going to be heading towards Marxism and socialism and communism, but not just yet. But I do want to point out to you that two of the most famous company towns in the United States was Pullman, Illinois, which is now a neighborhood of Chicago, but was once an independent town that was owned and operated by the Pullman Railroad Company, and they made rail cars, all in Pullman, Illinois. And perhaps the most famous company town of all, one that's so famous and ubiquitous for being a company town that it even bears the name of the company that started it, but we don't even think of it as a company town anymore, is Hershey, Pennsylvania, where candy bars and Hershey Kisses are all made. Hershey, Pennsylvania was a company town. Lowell, Massachusetts was a company town for textiles. So all of these company towns did exist at one time to serve the needs, again, of these efficient manufacturing operations. You may have also are familiar with a term called Dickensianism. If you've read anything by Charles Dickens, or as hopefully most of you have seen some sort of iteration of A Christmas Carol on television, specifically a version that takes place in the time in which the story was written, so the 1820s, 1830s, or 40s, somewhere in there between 1820s and 1840s. You called that Dickensian London or Dickensian England. And as you see it, the Muppet Christmas Carol actually looks like this too, and it's fairly. It has a nice look to it, which definitely speaks of Dickensianism. It is a kind of, think of London or Birmingham, England, or Manchester, England. These large cities, overpopulated, lots of poverty, starvation, infestation, rats, bugs, insects, shrouded and choked in coal dust and smoke. Definitely, you have the rich side of town and then the other side of town. The poor people who live in housing that is owned by landlords. People like Ebenezer Scrooge was supposed to be representative of this type of landlord class, who would overcharge for their housing. People who are barely making enough as it is, and in between this kind of upper echelon, people like Ebenezer Scrooge, and of course the nobility above him, and people who would live in the factory communities that you have here in this picture. You had people who would have been lawyers, they would have been doctors, they would have been members of a professional class, and also people like factory managers and factory overseers and engineers. These would be people that Marx eventually would call the bourgeois or part of the bourgeois, people who were able to climb the social and economic ladder through industrialization, but rather than help their fellow man up that ladder too, they turned and they used their newfound authority and newfound money to try and further stratify the society based on class. And although technically not a class, women were not really, especially in the United States, were not seen as citizens of that country. They were looked upon as dependents of their husbands or their eldest and most prominent male family member. But at this time, because of industrialization and over the course of the 1880s, 90s, certainly by World War One, the 1920s, and of course World War II, you have women moving ever more so in the workforce, into spheres that are public rather than private because of these newfound technologies and innovations. Some of them work as radio operators and telephone operators, as you can see here. Others become buyers and sellers and attendants at places like those newfound department stores that we saw. So there is opportunity here for people moving up, people moving in these industries. I don't want to paint it as bleak as what Dickens would or what Marx would. But then there's a reason why Dickens wrote what he wrote when he wrote it, and why Marx and Engels wrote what they wrote when they wrote it. So we have to take the good with the bad here and understand the dynamic aspect of industrialism, the greatness that we can see broadly, and of course the pain and suffering it can cause on a small micro level, the individual level.